Hi, welcome to the first episode of Castles and the Globe. My name is John Rice. With me is Alessandro Danselmi. Today, for our first podcast, we are going to be talking about critical theory, what it is, what its issues are, maybe some of what's good about it, and how it connects to Catholic social teaching, Catholic social justice. So, Alessandro, how are you doing today?
Pretty good. I'm awake, so that's a good thing.
That is a good thing. All right, do we just want to dive right in?
Yeah. So I think critical theory right now is sort of this extremely political topic, and a lot of it comes. A lot of the discussion around it is specifically around gender theory and critical race theory. But I think we can take a step back and sort of look at the roots of it throughout sort of the history of philosophy. And specifically, we can start by talking about Hegel. So throughout a lot of um, philosophical development, one of the best ways that philosophers found to sort of present their worldview was through sort of a narrative myth, right? And you can see this is based off of the structure of Genesis, right? Because when you have Genesis or in Genesis, you have this narrative myth that both explains, the nature of reality and like what it is, where it came from, the nature of man and his relationship to himself, man's relationship to nature, and then man's relationship to God. And those are basic axiomatical principles that you can build a philosophy off of. And it's the roots of what we call Judeo-Christian philosophy. When Christendom fell, so when sort of Catholicism lost its sort of hegemony over society, a lot of different philosophers presented new narrative myths on, because we got rid of Genesis. We
At
needed
this
to
point,
replace.
are we looking more at Enlightenment or a little bit before Enlightenment?
So what the Enlightenment project was essentially was trying to reframe a lot of the philosophical and theological thoughts on who we are, what our relationship to the state is, what our relationship to God is, what our relationship to rights are, for example. And you see this with, like, say, Rousseau, Hobbes, and Locke, who are the three of sort of the pillars of Enlightenment thought. They all presented different narrative myths or states of nature, as they called them, right? So Rousseau, it was like an Eden, and man was in harmony with nature. Then as man built up institutions, he removed himself from nature, right? So private property, marriage, etc. And so through Rousseauian thought, which heavily influenced the French Revolution, um, there was the idea that you need to tear down institutions to bring yourself closer to Eden, right? So tear down the church, tear down, the monarchy, tear down all these different institutions that bring us away from, the sort of Eden state of nature we have. Then Hobbes was the complete opposite, right? Hobbes said in the beginning there was this sort of man was beasts, or man were just like a bunch of beasts who were fighting over, and like a right is something you have a claim over. So if you claim something, you have a right to it. And then if somebody stronger than you claims it, they kill you, and then they have it. so essentially, right, institutions under Hobbes's system were built up to maintain order. So you give up your rights to something, to a higher sort of arbitrary power, and then that arbitrary power will then say what your rights are, essentially.
Yeah.
So this, you can kind of
Right.
this influence.
Society being like a society is a group of people who agree to give up the same rights for the sake of all their well-being. It's
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
the vein
So
that falls under Hobbes.
yes, and you can kind of see this with in sort of more fascistic thought, right? Um, and then Locke was more towards sort of the Genesis narrative. God gives intrinsic rights, and the states are meant to protect those rights or not. But anyway, the point of going over those is different philosophies present different narrative myths which try to describe what sort of like the first act of man is, what man's relationship to each other is, right? Hegel, I think this is the sort of late 1700s, early 1800s, sometime around then. He presented his own narrative myth, and if you think of this right in history, we're evolution's becoming more widely accepted, right? I think at this time, or there's sort of the thought of an evolving man, and when you look at sort of the evolution of man, that means that consciousness at some point must have evolved too. So what Hegel's project was to explain the evolution of consciousness into the first act of man. And when I say first, it's not like first temporally, it's sort of like the most fundamental and basic action.
Yeah, the primary.
Yeah, the primary action of man. So essentially what Hegel did was he looked at just a solitary man who's first coming into consciousness. And so it's like, how does a man come to consciousness? Right? So what he said is a man comes to consciousness when he goes outside of himself, turns around and looks back at himself as an other, right? And then conquers himself, right? So if you can think of this like more practically, if you're in control of your body and you can choose to do things, you have this power over your body, and in a way that like animals don't, right? You're not determined by your instincts or your nature. You actually have power over that, right? So the first act of man is this sort of conquer and domination of himself. And then that's pretty much all man knows how to do at this point. And then one man who's self-conscious comes into contact with another man who's self-conscious, right? What Hegel said is they're going to instantly revert to the only thing they know, right? And so this is none, and that's just domination and power, right? So he writes this in a phenomenology and spirit. I think it's the second chapter, Lordship and Bondage. But essentially, so what he does, and he's looking at this through a dialectic. Essentially, thesis meets an antithesis, and they come into conflict and produce.
Yeah.
So he says two men come into conflict, right? They're both self-conscious. They revert back to the only thing they know how to do, which is the domination and subjugation of the other, right? So they both other each other, and they engage in a life and death struggle, right? Where one ends up subjugating himself to the other, and the other becomes master. So you end up with a master and a slave. And that's the thesis of this sort of great dialectic of consciousness. And then what the slave soon realizes is that the master is only master because he's slave, right? The identity of the master is dependent on the slave being the slave. So through that dependency the master has on the slave is able to subvert that. And then the slave becomes master and the master becomes slave, right? And that's the antithesis.
Yeah, now correct me if I'm wrong. Does Hegel, I'm not making a statement, I'm asking a question because my history is a little bit off. Who predates who? Does Hegel come before Nietzsche or Nietzsche before Hegel? Yeah. Hegel's before Nietzsche. So all of Nietzsche's master-slave stuff comes off of Hegel.
Yeah,
right?
I think so.
Because Nietzsche is on similar veins as far as the conflict investigation. But something that I find really interesting in what you were pointing out is that primary part of man, of what Hegel's doing, is saying that the first thing that a man has to do to become self-conscious is to master himself. Mm-hmm. That's not a foreign notion or an alien notion. We actually see ideas of self-mastery all the way to the ancient Greeks. You have the idea of you've got the beast inside you and the lion inside you and the man inside you, and you have to feed the right one. You have to feed the man first so he takes over the lion, and you don't feed the monster at all. The lion needs to kill the monster. But if you feed the monster, then everything goes to crap because you're going to be a horrible person. And then you have like the Platonic ladder of virtue and all of these things that are really like self-mastery and trying to conquer a will inside of you that is distorted or not even distorted, but you've got your primary goods versus your lesser goods. Like, are you going after love or are you going after lust? Kind of breaking in, and you have to subjugate yourself
Mhm.
for that reason.
Yeah.
So it sounds like Hegel takes thousands of years of great philosophy and self-enrichment and things that kind of line up with like Catholic social teaching of self-mastery and all of that, and then completely departs from it.
Yeah, and again, it's an emphasis he places on what's happening, right? So again, right now we're at this antithesis where now the slave is the master and the master is the slave, right? So then the now slave, the former master, goes through the same process that the former slave went through, and is
Yeah.
able to then subvert the process himself, and they're sort of come to um, this mutual oppression of each other where cooperation can occur, right? So that's what right now our relationship, Hegel will say, is this mutual power struggle that we have going on that's reached some sort of synthesis because we're not killing each other.
Yeah. All human relationship can be dumbed down to a conflict of power.
Yeah. So right, and I guess Aquinas, right, or not Aquinas, Aristotle. When Aristotle writes the Nicomachean Ethics, right, he says that um, um, all action is directed towards an end. And
Mm-hmm.
so that then he studies various ends and various actions, and that's what the study of ethics is, right?
Yeah.
Like knowing the good and acting towards the good, and that's sort of how ethics was brought up. I think what Hegel sort of explicitly or implicitly is presenting is that the only end that exists is that of domination and power. And so all actions are directed towards that end, right? Which is very, very different from like you can have lots of it. Well, essentially, but Aristotle lays out there's the good, and you can know the good
Yeah.
and act towards the good.
Yeah.
Essentially,
With Aristotle, ironically, what we were thinking about talking about for this first episode is now what we're kind of getting into. With your with Aristotle, your will really only can act towards a good or the good.
yeah.
And whether you're looking at like the good and it's a true good, or if it's a false good or a perceived good
Mhm.
or a lesser good, your will is still moving towards a good. And there's a very large amount of things that could be considered good. And yeah, I agree
Yeah.
with you. Hegel seems to narrow it down to saying the only good that your will is moving towards, the only end your will is moving towards, is domination.
Mhm. Yeah. And
Whereas
it's not only that's the only end you know how to move towards,
yeah,
right? But by your very nature. Yes, so a lot of that it comes down to, and I think Nietzsche talks about the will to power, and a lot of sort of, I know Foucault, Derrida, a lot of the existentialists who came after, they utilized a lot of this thinking that power is fundamentally power of language, the power of etc.
I
Blah, blah,
mean,
blah.
read the Flies by Jean-Paul Sartre, and it's exactly this.
Oh, what do you say that was? I missed the title.
The play The Flies.
Oh
It's
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, for those who don't know, it is taking, I want to say it's the Agamemnon story from the ancient Greeks and retelling it under existentialist philosophy.
Mhm.
And the reason it's called The Flies is because the whole town is covered in flies. There's a lot of symbolic meaning that you can dive into, or you can just say that the curtains are blue and move on. But it's essentially rewriting an ancient Greek play with the new understanding of how human society works and its existentialism.
Yeah. Yes, so I guess jumping back to critical theory and how that relates to Hegel, because I mean there's all this talk about critical theory in the news, but like where does Hegel come into this? Well, essentially you can trace certain thoughts throughout the history of philosophy, and Hegel was this sort of fundamental figure, and then what he did, or what that sort of basis that he left on was heavily influenced Marx. So now Marx philosophically, I'm not talking about Marxist economics, but philosophically, what Marx said was that you can expand that idea of consciousness out to a group. So you can have what's called a class consciousness, right?
Yeah.
So his proposition was not just this is the history of an individual, like an individual relationship, but he translated this power dialectic between individuals to be a power dialectic throughout all of history, right? So what he was saying was capitalism is the sort of thesis where you have the bourgeoisie oppressing the proletariat, right? And you have that master-slave relationship. The bourgeoisie is dependent on the labor of the proletariat. So, and what the proletariat needs to do is come to a collective class consciousness of that, realize that their masters are dependent on them, and then subvert the entire process, right? Yeah, so essentially politically, right, socialism would be the inversion of that sort of capitalistic state where the proletariat rise up and utterly dominate the bourgeoisie, right? Then the bourgeoisie, because they also have a class consciousness, while they're in this, they will remain, they'll become the proletariat now, they'll become the slaves type, and then they'll do the same process, and there'll be a mutual cooperation between bourgeoisie and proletariat. This is why he talks about
everybody's equal, and the means of production are controlled by everybody. And
but even removing it away from the economic lens, it's sort of the idea of classes. It's not just like everybody's equal, it's that the actual classes will be in a mutual cooperation, and the distinction won't be there so much.
Something interesting to note, a lot of people don't realize this, the word capitalism is actually coined by Karl Marx.
And
he's the origin of the definition of capitalism, and the name capitalism. So all of his
you a capitalist? No, I don't like Marx philosophy.
For a regulated free market, which is not the same as capitalism. But yeah, he essentially made up a word and then complained about it.
Yeah, well, he created a class consciousness, right?
He created the class consciousness that he's trying to say needs to subvert the other. Like that's
but again, moving from that, you see Hegel was the individual. Marx translated Hegel's sort of dialectic to classes, and then you can see there's been multiple other transfers of that dialectic to various different groups. So Simone de Beauvoir famously, in The Second Sex, directly translated sort of Hegel through Marx into what's essentially modern feminism, right? And there was, you talked about Speechless earlier, the Knowles book, something Knowles brings up.
Great book. Speechless, controlling thoughts, controlling minds. Controlling words, controlling minds.
Not sponsored.
Out of us.
Yeah, but something he mentions, and it's a really interesting debate between, I think it was Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir. What happened was Betty Friedan, I'm pretty sure it's Betty Friedan, I think she wrote The Feminist Mystique. She was one of the sort of popular 80s feminists. I think my mom studied under her. But they had this debate where sort of the old school feminists were saying, women should be allowed to choose whatever they want to do, right? If they want to stay home and have a family, they should be able to stay home and have a family. If they want to go into the workforce, they should be able to go to the workforce. Simone de Beauvoir, however, said, no, you have to force women into the workforce because they would choose otherwise. Basically, their class consciousness is telling them not to. So
too many of them would choose to be stay-at-home moms if you don't force them.
And then you can't overthrow the dialectic, or you can't move on with the dialectic without sort of that force. And this is really apparent when you read The Second Sex, right? She's saying how she essentially says, it's been a while, but women as a group has always seen themselves in relationship to man and define and identifies themselves by a man, right? So that's just like laying out the thesis, and then she's leads on, says we have to subvert that if we want progress or whatever. But now, like, critical theory, right? You have the existentialists who come in on one side with a lot of thought about power, the power of language. You have this sort of Hegelian dialectic through Marx coming in at another angle, and then you also have the Frankfurt School, which were more Marxists, also working on this, and they sort of compiled together these sort of fundamental axiomatical principles laid out by a lot of existentialists and continental philosophers to produce this critical theory thing.
Yeah.
And essentially what it is now is it's breaking up the world into different classes or different groups, pitting those groups together or against each other, and then demanding that we move forward through sort of the conflict between the groups, right? And this is interesting, right? Because something that the critical theory in the Frankfurt School and a lot of these people realized was that communism doesn't work, right? Like,
no. Yeah.
Like, it doesn't work, but they didn't give up on the project, right? So if you think of that sort of historical dialectic as like thesis, antithesis, or thesis, antithesis, synthesis, what they proposed was every time, the reason communism didn't work was every time you come to a synthesis, that group sort of consolidates and then finds a new oppressor, right? So essentially what you have is like thesis, antithesis, synthesis, which comes together to form a new thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So there is only the critique, and the critique is the sort of finding power structures in society and then tearing them down for the sake of this sort of constant progress, right? You need to have these people who are critiquing and tearing down power structures in society. And then as soon as they tear down power structures in society, they become the oppressors. And then the next generation will find their power structures and tear them down. And that is what the historical progress looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's sort of the rundown, the spark notes on what critical theory kind of is. And you can sort of see it bouncing around politics and nobody really knows what they're talking about. There's a couple good people who know this stuff.
Little bit.
Relating this, I think, we can just juxtapose this with, I guess, Catholic social teaching, which is really interesting. And it's a completely different view of looking at society and looking at man. And it's completely incompatible with critical theory, but
yeah.
Do you have anything, or
no? You
right, yeah. So essentially, right, one of the big faults of critical theory is that every action fundamentally is an act towards power, right?
Yeah.
So every relationship you have is, I guess, based on power. And that's not really the best way of putting it. But for example, you can sort of understand it by looking at individual relationships. So like our relationships, we're just seeking power over each other in this conversation. If you think about your relationship between you and your father, you and your parents to each other, the relationship between you and a professor, you and a, say, police officer, you and a girlfriend, you and a child, all of those, the only thing that you're going for is this quest for power, right? And right, that's something I reject. And why do I reject that? Well, I've been like loved by my parents before, and I know my parents, aren't seeking power over me when they do stuff for me. They're doing it out of love and not power.
Maybe they don't realize it though. Maybe they actually are acting out of power.
Yeah. So the response,
they're so blinded that they think that they're acting out of love when really they're just controlling your life.
Yes. So the response to that is very cynical, right? So either you can love people essentially in sort of the critical theory lens. There's really no room for altruism or like selfless love or self-sacrificial love, right? So either there comes to a conflict that either everybody's just out for power, or like you can love, hate, and have complex emotions towards someone. So, right, like you see, in boiling down human interaction, they came up with this one simple thing. That's even like power is kind of an ill-defined term, right?
Mhm.
Like power is just like, I don't know, right? When I think of power, I think of like the ability to influence and direct somebody. Right? It can be through money,
Yeah.
fame, whatever. And you have various types of power. Like if I'm a mechanic working on a car and you bring your car to me, and like I have a certain power over you, and you trust me and respect me because I just have knowledge about cars, right?
Yeah.
But like is that relationship me seeking power over you? Right? In the same way, is the relationship of like, well, yeah, taking a step back, right? I've said before, I've experienced relationships that I love. I've loved people and I've been loved by people, right? So either that didn't happen and that was all an illusion, or this critical thing is missing something like kind of big. um,
Mm.
yeah. Sorry, train of thought crashed. But yeah. So either so when you come into like if you accept that everything is just cynicism and power, then you start viewing other people's actions that way, right? Like, and you see this, you have, and now this isn't specific to critical theory. It's specific. A lot of teenage anxiety shows this. When you have like the question, if you're a teenager and you have the question like, I don't really think my friends are my friends, they just want something from me, or you're in a relationship where you feel like you're not actually being loved, they just like want to use you or something, right? Those are all um those are all sort of expressions of wondering if people are just after power, right? So if you accept, right, that everybody's after power, then you're going to start treating people as if their actions are just out of power, right? So your parents aren't doing what they think's right for you. Your parents are just trying to control you, right? Your girlfriend's not doing what is not trying to, I don't know, lead you to holiness, but she just wants to control you,
Mm-hmm.
right? So then you start acting, right? The only thing you can do, well, if you accept like all I can do is seek power, then you're going to actually start just seeking power with your friends. You're not going to be able to build strong relationships. You're not going to be able to build strong friendships, or like the virtuous friendships, right? You're just going to build little quests for power throughout your life. And that's it. And it's ultimately very meaningless, because what's the purpose of that power? Well, to have power. Like
it kind of at a certain point is like,
yeah,
great, you have power, now what?
Yeah, so it's sort of this loneliness and this isolation that comes out. And Marx does talk about this. He sees that there's a lot of alien, sort of also he uses the term alienation a lot, right? He says there's alienation from work, alienation from each other, and he sort of accuses the economic system of producing this alienation, right? So if he would say, if you are working like a widget factory making little toys or something, and you're cranking out a bunch of them, you don't own the toys you're making. You're just sort of hired to use somebody else's means of production, somebody else's tools, to make something you don't own, and then you're paid less than what those things you made are worth. So you're undervaluing your labor, alienating yourself from us. You don't actually own the things you're making. So you're alienating yourself from your work. You're alienating yourself from your labor, which you're selling. You're alienating yourself from other people, because they're all alienating themselves. So it's this like thing of alienation. Right, his solution was just like everybody should be alienated equally, which again didn't work. But he did strike something that that's really true. That like when you are just out for say money or power or these sort of like fame or whatever, you do end up alienating yourself and using people. And then when you start using people, people pick up on that and they start using you. And then all of your relationships are based because you sort of form your relationships and the people around you to do this, to just alienate everybody.
Sounds like a very lonely world.
It is. It's what it's like to be a Democrat, I think. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding.
I don't think you are.
No. So again, there's this. We're talking about this Catholic social teaching thing, which I think is a great response to both like the free market libertarian types and the sort of radical critical theory types, which is that like one, it's fundamentally the principle that you can be loved and you can love other people, right?
Yeah.
It's sort of, you use the Aristotelian foundation that you can know there is a good, something good, there is this good, you can know it and you can act towards it, right? And fundamentally the life is built out of relationships between people. Those relationships can be altruistic and tend to be altruistic, right? So the idea of Catholic social teaching, I think, is fundamentally localized and relationship oriented.
Yeah.
So it's saying that the first society, the fundamental pinning, sort of fundamental building block of society is the family. It's the relationship between parents and children, right? And then you have lots of families together and they relate to each other, right? And that is what society is, right? And then those families build up relationships between individual members of those families, and individual families build up relationships in sort of these other types of families called institutions, right? And those institutions then support each other and support the families and then build up more institutions. And you end up getting this picture of society where you have like this family in the middle, and then you have broader institutions that sort of encircle it on multiple levels.
Yeah.
And it's all authority then, right, is sort of human authority. You could say authority originally comes from God, but the human authority comes from that family relationship and that family building, right? And what the principle of subsidiarity demands is that all power and authority ought to remain in that lowest common denominator, which is the family, right?
Yeah.
So now there are certain things that a family can't do, right? Like families can't pave the interstates or make sure the garbage runs on time, or all these different things that are just aspects of daily living. So what you do is when the family can't do something, right? There's something too big for them, right? Then it's picked up by the next level. So your family can't do something, it's picked up by your parish or your neighborhood, right? Or say you have a group of families and a father dies, right? It is up to that community to take care of the widow and orphans, right?
Yeah.
So now say they can't, say there's something that's bigger than that. Then what you do is you move up to say like you move from the family to the community to say the city, and then the city has to pave the roads, make sure the garbage runs on time, make sure people aren't speeding, and then you move up another level to say like the state or the federal government and all these things. But fundamentally what subsidiarity maintains, and what one of the most basic principle of Catholic social teaching is that power and there's a distinction between power and authority, right? And all authority ought to boil down as much as possible, right? In the same way, if I so then there's a difference between the authority between say me or like a father and a son, so me and my dad, there's a certain authority and a certain power dynamic, you can say, between us, and that's governed by a certain type of justice, right? So the power dynamic between me and my father is governed by distributive justice. That's the distribution of justice in or the mode of justice that enacts within a specific sphere of society, right?
Yeah.
But then you have these spheres of society, and they relate to each other. So our family relates to the city, which relates to the bowling club, which relates to the parish, right? So the relationship between the spheres of society is governed by a mode of justice called social justice, which has been absolutely, the idea of it, which has been absolutely brutalized by our friends on the left. But
SJWs.
yeah, the social justice warriors, right? But when you think about that, what is a violation of social justice, right? We would say in Catholic social thought, a violation of social justice is the abuse or the breaking the principle of subsidiarity, right? So if the city government were to take on themselves a duty and authority which is owed to the family, which is owed to a lower or a more fundamental aspect of society, that is a violation of social justice, right?
Yeah.
In the same way, if a family were to not give the what is owed to the city, like say your family doesn't pay their taxes, right? Violation of social justice. A city then demanding or like seizing children or you know seizing authority that's not theirs from the family and it ought to remain in the family is a violation of social justice the other way. So it goes both ways.
Yeah.
Yeah. So those are, so you can see it kind of like across, I guess. Like distributive justice relates within the family and social justice relates, from the family to other aspects of society. But I mean, distributive justice isn't exclusively to the family. It's within every sphere of society.
Yeah, every sphere has its own
kind
of crisscrossing that's happening. Yeah.
But essentially that begins to weave a very intricate tapestry of what society and what our relationship to each other is, and it's not very much. Well, let me say it's not the most simple thing. It's not just we're seeking power over each other, but it is a much more beautiful thing, and I think it's also much truer than sort of the continental or Hegelian notion.
Yeah, because there can in those different bubbles there can be a lot of different motives and a lot of different things going into it, but at the end of the day, you're right, like it's supposed to trickle down into the family and really be like stabilizing and protecting the family as much as it can. Yeah. And when you look at a family, like the sacrifice that a father and a mother have for their kids or have for each other, like it's a level of selflessness. It's not a power struggle.
Yeah.
At least it shouldn't be. So from your very get-go, it seems like you've got Catholic social justice being a selflessness versus critical theory being a power struggle. And they do not line up in any way.
They're
like from the very beginning, they are opposed to each other. So naturally, as they both continue to develop and you get more into their structures, it's going to be even more polar opposites.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's but I mean, I think that's a lot. We can probably continue this conversation later.
Yeah, I'm sure
we
will.
Over the half-hour mark and reaching the end. But yeah, I think it's Catholic social teaching, and Catholic social teaching is a lot more intricate than just this sort of abstract concept. It actually demands certain things of society, demands certain sacrifices, and I think it leads to a better, more fulfilling life than. But who wants to be fulfilled, right?
Maybe someday.
Yeah.
Grant me chastity, but not yet. St. Augustine.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you guys for watching. Thank you, Sandro, for all of that on critical theory. He actually wrote his thesis on this, right?
Yeah. I tried,
Yeah.
or I did.
Yeah, you did.
Okay.
So he knows a lot more about it than me. We will see you guys next week. This has been Castles and the Globe with John Rice and Alessandro Dansami.
Okay. Bye bye.